Have you ever been told that speaking in tongues is not for today? Maybe you've heard people speak in tongues and it seemed weird. You thought to yourself, this is too strange to be God. Or maybe you believe that people can still speak in tongues today, but that it's not for everybody. Whether you're skeptical or intrigued, whether you speak in tongues or don't, my new book, 9 Lies People Believe About Speaking in Tongues, is the book for you. Get your copy wherever Christian books are sold and head over to stevebremner.com and click on the first link on the homepage for more information about how you can spread the word. Enjoy the show.
Dropping some knowledge and a little love. This is the Fire on Your Head podcast with your host, Steve Bremner. Steve Bremner, missionary to Peru and blogger at stevebremner.com. The podcast where we tackle gray areas your pastor doesn't talk about. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Bremner.
Greetings. You're listening to Fire on Your Head. I'm Steve Bremner, and with me today, I've finally got Dave Edwards back on it. It's almost like for our annual podcast. It seems like we don't do them as often as we used to. But how you been?
You're doing great, man. It's really good to be back on here. Yeah, I feel like we used to do it monthly or, every other month, and it's been only a couple times a year last couple of years, but it's not easy taking over the world. So you're busy taking over the southern hemisphere, and I'm busy up here in the northern. But yeah, man, it's great to connect, great to be back on. It's really awesome just to see, I think I first started podcasting with you in 2009, and in the last 7 years, just to see how far it's come, to see your dreams for this podcast just be fulfilled, all the connections you made, and just how it's beginning to influence, how it's beginning to become a source of fire and revival for those who are listening to it. It's amazing to have walked with you instead of, say, if I came into the show at this point, rather than all those years ago. It's neat to see how it's grown and expanded and how your dreams are just really coming to the surface.
Okay, wow. Wasn't expecting any of that.
Well, I just kind of follow the trail of my mind and just go sometimes, bro.
I was reading a link, and then I listened to a podcast by Praying Medic about his trip to be on the Sid Roth show. And how that's going to air. I don't know when we'll publish this conversation of ours, but anyway, it's like 6 or 8 weeks later, that episode will air. And him and his wife made a podcast talking about it and stuff. And I was thinking to myself, like, how many people have we had on this podcast who have also been on, like, It's Supernatural with Sid Roth? You know what I mean? Like, some people before they've been on this podcast, some people afterward.
Yeah.
Like Bert Farias and Shane Wall and Praying Medic and then other people like Art Thomas and Jesse Berkey. They had already been on that show, and I'm like, wow, sitting at my desk down here in Peru.
And did you know that that's the number one, I guess, charismatic Christian show on TV?
I did not know that. Should I have known that?
I just found out about it.
Oh, yeah?
I was talking to a friend, and he, I guess because it's supernatural. I was
but is it like, what makes it number one? Is it like a ratings thing? Is it like I don't know, likes on a Facebook page? Like what makes it the number one?
I guess it's just the content, the supernatural stories. I mean, you talk about the angelic, you talk about healing, and, I don't know, maybe because Bill and Benny Johnson have been on there several times and they just have such a wide range of influence. But
right.
I think it's just what the world's looking for. They're looking for that supernatural element of Christianity. And I think that's one of the sources, that provides a certain expression of that. And Sid's been doing this thing for like 30 years, just hardcore and raw, and it's supernatural, and he just kind of goes for it.
Right.
But yeah, so it's amazing to see people who are having on, Fire on Your Head end up just speaking to so many people out there via that outlet.
Right. Well, and I don't say this as like a self-deprecating kind of thing, but like by no means do we have like an audience or a reach at the moment like Sid Roth or any of these guys. So it's kind of like funny to me. And then we have people on who they sell books out the wazoo compared to sales of our stuff. And yet, God orchestrates our paths to be able to sit down and talk to some of these people. And I stay in touch with many of them. And so, yeah, for me, it's just kind of mind-boggling. I'm looking forward to the day where it's like nothing to put a podcast on the internet and it's like 10,000 people listen to it or something.
I mean, everybody who's doing this and everyone who has that reach, they started somewhere.
Sure.
And they went before us. And that's kind of what I mentioned at the beginning. It's just neat to see it grow. It's neat to see it expand. And how, as your calling begins to expand, your ability to handle the expansion of the influence, I think, parallels that.
Right.
And the quality of the show is increasing. And everything increases as the sphere of influence gets larger and larger. And things we used to ramble about for hours can take, a few minutes. A lot of those old shows that might not even be, available anymore, those have established a foundation to have precise, accurate content that's just going to activate people. It's going to open them up to the spirit of revival. It's going to open them up to the reality of, the God's a burning fire, and he can possess and consume everything we do through creative expression, through our spheres of influence, whether we're working or in ministry, whether we're in, a third world country, first world country, somewhere in between doing the thing that we're doing. It's an ever-expanding kingdom. And I feel like, just like the words in ever-expanding Revelation, and every day God's fresh and new, if you really put yourself in posture to where the thing that is your dream, for example, like a podcast or your book, I think it can actually grow and develop with it. And if you're able to recognize that, you can fine-tune it as you go. Wow.
And for the listeners' benefit, no, I did not PayPal Dave any kind of money to say these things to me. But yeah, man, you really think this podcast is getting better? Can you tell the difference in microphone?
Well, yeah, and there's something about it that's attracting these people who are also attracted to things like Sid Roth, And I mean, it's just growth. It's life. It's
right.
Putting your hand to it and it's expanding. And I remember the times when it's like, should we keep going with it? And you were like, Dave, should I keep going with it? And stuff like that. And you just always, you stuck with it and you persevered.
Sure.
And that's just a testimony to anything in the gospel. The testing of the faith develops perseverance. But what we don't realize is that, okay, I'll finally get done. No, it's all of a sudden the entire way I was looking at the event or that thing that was hard in the moment, all of a sudden explodes into light and life, and it becomes like, just like terraforms. It's like you felt like you're in the desert, but all of a sudden there's a beach and palm trees and a nice, cold glass of water. And it's like, okay, it didn't feel so bad now that I've reached the destination. It begins to expand.
Well, I don't even feel like I've reached where I've always imagined this podcast could go. I feel like we ain't seen nothing yet.
But yeah, that's what keeps it going and developing.
Sure. But if you look back on like the last 5 years or whatever, like, do you remember it was like 5 years ago and we were sitting down and basically talking like every week for 2 or 3 months. And I've got some of those podcasts on my phone where like a week or two ago, I was eating Chinese food somewhere near my house and waiting, just listening to like when you and I were talking about repentance or mind renewal and stuff. And I'm listening to it going like, this is good stuff. Like, pretend it's not me that I'm listening to. You know what I mean?
It's so good, dude. It's like I go back and listen to some of those conversations, and it's fresh fuel for today. I'm like,
yeah, that's my point. And do you remember, like, me and you would kind of joke around? I don't remember if it was on recordings or offline, about trying to like not talk too much about modern news or current fads and stuff, and just talk about like biblical stuff. So that, like, my goal was so that this stuff could sit on the internet for years and years and still be relevant to someone who discovers the podcast and goes through the archives. And, 5 years is not very long. I mean, I plan on having these on the internet for decades if that's how technology and whatever works.
That's a legacy. I mean,
and then some of the podcasts I listen to where I talk too much with people about something going on then and there is kind of boring. You know what I mean? But like the ones from that day with you, those days with you, like that, I remember, I'll never forget how you and I were talking, and we had both come to the conversation with a bunch of notes about stuff and repentance stuff. And then we decided to like take a bathroom break and get another coffee and whatever, and sit back down and wing it, because, you know, we'd basically gone through our notes or whatever. And they made this good part 1 and part 2 like series, you know, or you know, some of those ones from sitting at your table when I visited you in Atlanta later that year, and you know, some of those ones I listened. So I'm saying that to say we really need to do these more often than we do. You know, there's like this time and place where interviewing different guests, new guests, and talking about their books or their blogs or ministries and stuff, or basically like anyone Eric Gilmore ever recommends to me that I interview. But then sitting down and talking to you and not worrying about reach, not worrying about you know, like other stuff that I factor in differently when I interview other people, you know, like to just sit down and chat like you and I do.
When you know the person, like with me, we've known each other long enough that we've gotten through misunderstandings. We've gotten through learning how we communicate. You know,
and like
I've learned how to speak Canadian when I'm on the phone or on Skype with you, or like
I don't even know what that
mannerisms
means.
Or like if I say something, I can almost gauge your response with the way I say it.
Sure.
And so
I guess.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
As I say that, you're like, what are you talking about, bro?
Yeah, I have no idea. Or like when people, they like, I watch people say that they preface that like Steve's a Canadian, or, you know, like they say like my missionary friend who's Canadian, like they insert he's Canadian, like that matters. Like, I don't know. I imagine it's like the same way they would say like, oh, he has Asperger's, or, you know, like he's Canadian or something, you know, because I don't ever interview people or introduce them and say, you know, they're American.
My American friend Dave was
like, yeah, it's just like another kingdom builder today. And because probably the majority of the people I have on are like Americans anyway. And I remember I had a roommate at Fire where every time we were in public, he would find some kind of way to like tell someone, you'll have to forgive him, he's Canadian. And I'm like, what the heck? That has nothing to do with anything. So I started doing that. I started doing that to him. Like, even though I'm living in America, I'd be like, you'll have to forgive him, he's American. And that's hilarious to me, like with
that's awesome.
My Canadian cadence. And there's just a humor that Canadians understand about each other. But yeah, and then he would just look at me like...
I've seen Canadians do it to each other, though. Like, I'll see it, like, I don't know, at least once a week on Facebook. There's some kind of Canadian joke. And I used to tag you in it a lot, but it was like, right. I'm actually playing into the system, so I quit tagging you. I was like, you probably already heard it anyways.
It's like those Jimmy Kimmel bits where they're on the street interviewing people, and he just makes something up, and they're going on without knowing what they're talking about. And there used to be this comedian in like the 90s. He would do that. He would go to the States. He would go to your country, and he would, you know, be interviewing people on the streets about stuff about Canada, and then put it on the show, and that was like hilarious, you know, but not to any American friends I showed that to. You know what I mean? They'd be like, I don't appreciate you making fun of us, you know? We make fun of you guys and your igloos and stuff all the time, but no, you can't come down here and make fun of us on our turf. Like, anyway, so getting a little sidetracked, but yeah, man. And today, recording with you is an experiment as well, because I'm doing it with new equipment I've been able to accumulate over the last few months. And so we'll see how the end result of this goes. A lot of things are new about how I'm trying to record today, not the least of which is software I have to relearn. But anyway, yeah, I finally got like one of those boom stands that like you hook onto your desk and radio hosts and people use. I'm getting that set up and hooking up this microphone that I got blessed with while I was in Canada. And it's kind of like, why didn't I do this stuff sooner? And here's how I'm going to segue. The other day, I tried recording one of my like monologue type of episodes, where I sit down and just kind of share my heart or preach or something into the microphone. And I was doing it in my new little like sound booth I made in the closet. And it wasn't until like editing that I could hear pounding and hear some kind of like construction or something going on like above me. And it was faint, but it was like enough that I was like, I'm not gonna publish this episode. But it's interesting you talked about like when you were complimenting me a minute ago or a few minutes ago about going through this podcast for years and stuff. In that recording I wanted to produce, I was sharing like different book recommendations and audiobooks I've been listening to, and the common theme that they all had. They were I've been listening to people like Seth Godin and Todd Henry, and they talk about things like going for it, going for it, not waiting for permission, not waiting for someone to, don't wait to put your book out there until like a publisher will publish it. Or if you're a musician, like don't wait for like a record label to sign you. Like don't wait for somebody else to give you permission. Does that make sense? And I remember,
yeah, totally.
In the early days of doing this podcast with Dan Slavin, for like a while, I had to teach people what a podcast was, or how to listen to it, or where you can get them. And it seemed like nobody was really willing to come on the podcast until they could see it for themselves what it was. Like, you know what I mean? There was like SJ, I think, was the first, or unless you count like Dima, I don't know if you remember him.
Was he the Google Tongues guy?
And I did that one with him later, but he was.
And that was your first one to go viral.
Yeah, if you want to call it viral. It was viral in China. Yeah. All those thousands of hits were in China. But I remember just Dima and this other Dutch guy named Alka. And like these guys were the only guys willing to just sit down and go like, I don't know what Steve's doing, but like, yeah, okay, we'll do this. But it took like actually putting it out there and having people see for themselves what it is before I was able to start getting people go like, yeah, if you ever need to like talk to somebody about this subject, I'm down. Like, then I started to have people, inviting themselves my way.
Yeah, you're ahead of the curve on podcasting.
I don't think I'm ahead of the curve. I just been like, it's kind of like a big thing now, or like it's kind of come back in vogue.
Especially within our circles and Christian circles. I mean, I got friends who have spheres of influence. I'm like, bro, you got a podcast. I think that would be great. And it's like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. And so I think you're definitely riding the wave out in front a little bit, or caught the first wave. And some other
early adopter.
I mean, obviously there's those big ones like Relevant or Jesus Culture Podcast or something who, because of their thousands of followers, they explode right away.
Right.
But what you've learned along the way, and what I've learned along the way, I think is just going to feed into in the future. Just it continuing to get better and grow and expand.
Well, it's all about platform. And so some of these people already have a platform and then they launch a podcast. With me, it's been like a slow building momentum of it being part of building a platform. And I think like another thing, if I remember when I was kind of like spontaneously doing my little recording in the closet the other day, because that's where all my soundproof gear or whatever is. I remember saying like, it's like I wanted to do this stuff and I don't know who to copy, who to follow. Nobody out there has a template. And then now I think in the previous week I had 3 different people tell me they all wanted to start a podcast, and they were writing me or messaging me about like, what microphone do I need to buy? What do I need to do? And I'm thinking to myself like, okay, there's a reason people come to me. They see somebody to ask, or somebody who's gone down that path. I felt like with writing and podcasting, there wasn't anyone like I was copying or able to go, okay, let's, follow their example. It's been a lot of trial and error, and definitely a lot of error, but there's things like, why didn't I think of this sooner? Why didn't I think of this sooner? And I think, and I don't know if this is where you're tracking with me, but like I really wanted to recommend some things to people. And maybe I'll do another podcast going through some audiobooks and Kindle books, because I know we're short on time with you and I want to get you going. But, like I was, like one book that made an impact on me was called Die Empty, Unleash Your Best Work Every Day. And it had to do with like, he begins the book by saying cemeteries are full of untested ideas and dreams that people never bothered to try fulfilling, and stuff like that. Like, or Choose Yourself, was a book I listened to. Don't wait for somebody to choose you, choose yourself. Don't wait for somebody to pick you, give you permission, whatever. So anyway,
yeah, I'm totally tracking. I mean, some of the things, when I go to places and I'm praying and I'm like, Jesus, what do you want to speak? Like if I'm ministering somewhere or if I'm just visiting a church or a city, I'm really into like, what are the plans in heaven? What is the destiny for this area, for this region? When God was creating the world, creating the universe, making all the people and placing every single person in each generation just to kind of fit in his plan and design for everything. Like if I go to a city or church, I'm like, all right, Jesus, what is the intention of this church? Like what needs to happen? For example, if you go into like this old city that has all of this history, like did all of the history take place in that city that heaven designed for it to do? Or were those people, like you just mentioned, who lived their lives, but they never risked it. They never went for their dreams, and they lived and they died without seeing it fulfilled. When that dream wasn't just inclusive, but it was expansive. It wasn't designed just for them to have fulfillment and purpose in life. It was designed to impact all the people around them. And in doing so, the people around them, their dreams would begin to rise to the surface. Right. What if all the cities and places and churches and people were going for it, like you mentioned a moment ago? Just write the book, just do the podcast, let those dreams come out. Don't worry about failing. You hear a lot of times in the Bethel environment, we say faith is spelled R-I-S-K.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are these hidden destinies in people around you? And I think that's the beauty of the prophetic. If I'm giving someone the prophetic word, I'm like, Jesus, what are they called to do? What have you designed for them that makes them thrive, makes them come alive? So I try to see that treasure hidden with them, inside of them, speak to it and draw it to the surface. And the thing could even be said with the content here on Fire on Your Head podcast. It's like, hopefully the content that the listeners are hearing inspires dreams to come out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of tying into the whole journey of that we've kind of unintentionally stumbled upon, talking about how Fire in Your Head has grown and how you went for it and I went for it, and we're still coming together, sharing a heart on this podcast. It can definitely be a source of manna, a source of influence. It can even be a prophetic influence in people's lives, not just to hear a good teaching or hear a good conversation that's Christ-centric and has revival as its underlying emphasis, but they can hear something that awakens dreams in their hearts and in their lives. You tracking?
Oh, yeah. And I wrote down just here my little Evernote folder. This is what I wrote down. Can you see it first, or do you need to watch someone else do it first? And it doesn't have to apply to book writing or music or podcasting or anything, but like you're talking about, taking cities and flowing in the prophetic. Like the difference between like a pioneer and a settler. Not that one. Like I'm more of a settler with stuff, but like you were mentioning the other day or the other moment about riding the wave and being on this podcasting thing before it was a thing. I look at it more like I'm more like an early adopter, and I settle. It's like I could see where this might go, and I liked it. But what about like someone listening and it applies elsewhere in another way, like in their ministry or their in the marketplace or their whatever God has put them on this earth to do. And like I mentioned specifically with the podcast, it took like a while before I ever had guests on, because at first nobody really cared. Nobody wanted to be on it. It was like, is Steve serious about this thing? Whatever it is, And then, now I sometimes get unsolicited invitations, from people who would like to be on it. And it's like, okay, I'll take that into consideration. Like what happened from one to the other. And, like I'm reading all sorts of stories of, or books or listening to audiobooks about people who, went for it or they started their thing. I listened to the Steve Jobs biography. Like I get sucked into biographies about people who did things, whether they're saved or not. And I guess you could call it vision. Let's use that buzzword. Vision is what? Seeing the destination, seeing the goal, seeing where you're going. Maybe God gives you the vision. God gives you like a prophetic destination to get to. And so you got to take the steps to get there. And some people like me, I need to go on the internet and Google tutorials and YouTube videos and copy somebody else who's taken me through the steps. Like, that's kind of inherent in my nature. Whereas like other people, they're just going to plow forward and go for it and fix the mistakes they make along the way. And basically
which is more like me. I just like, hey, let's jump off the cliff. Is there water down there? Wait a minute.
Or maybe not call it a mistake, but like go for it and not let waiting for everything to be perfect stop you from going for it. You know what I mean?
The thing that really feeds into personality types, you know. You got all types of tests out there now, Strength Finders, Enneagram, and it just kind of tells you who you are.
Right.
But I think in the grand scheme of things, you can look at the Christian journey or the journey in life as part of a bigger picture of the kingdom. The pioneer is a great example. The pioneer plows through the jungle, creates a clearing, and that clearing becomes a campground, which becomes a settlement.
Right.
And that settlement ends up becoming, you know, like an outpost, and then eventually become a city. The people, okay, I see where you went. I see that you were able to establish something concrete. Now we want to come join you and help you build what you're doing.
Right.
And some people, when they get there, that's the sphere of influence, that outpost connecting the old world to that. And then the pioneer climbs that tower and says, look, there's something else out there. I'm going to clear another road, another pathway into the future. And so it becomes linked together.
Right.
I think where we miss it sometimes is that we think that wherever we're at on that journey, we call it irrelevant. But whether you're a pioneer spirit or you want to expand that sphere of influence, or you're somewhere in between, it's like, hey, you back there, there's something ahead, and you're the one that's in between, casting vision in both directions. It's neat to just learn where your place is. So you don't always have to be that gung-ho pioneer, but you can still have the spirit of a pioneer if your heart's always to move forward. It's always to see what God's doing next and what his desire is, not only for you, but for those around you, and how that sphere of influence can be lit up. It can actually be tuned to the frequency of heaven and make the sound in the earth is designed to make, that advances the kingdom and advances, civilization. For the longest time, for thousands of years, the church is, any new technological breakthrough that came out, the church is like, that's evil. This is a sign of the end times.
Right.
I think it's the exact opposite. He made us to be creative. He made us to expand and to fill the cosmos. He made us to do all these wonderful things. And so, here's something that might step on toes, but I'm thinking about
we don't ever step on toes.
Yeah. I'm thinking about money and currency. And everyone thinks that if money becomes completely technological and you lose the actual monetary thing that you put in your hand, that somehow that's got to be the mark of the beast. But that makes no sense. It's just a switch in mediums. Make sense?
Yes.
Like, I don't have all my credit card information on my cell phone yet because I don't want to lose my cell phone. But I don't like carrying around wads of cash. I've even switched wallets now to where my wallet just holds like my driver's license and my debit card and a couple other things. There's no room in my wallet for cash because I don't want to be stuck behind. I'm not saying cash is evil. I'm just saying I'm looking at the times. I'm looking at my generation, and I want to own it. I want to be on the forefront of where technology is going. Just because there's a technological advancement and it didn't come from a, quote, saved Christian doesn't mean that it wasn't God. It doesn't mean that God wasn't able to use that purpose to advance mankind, to become awesome, to create, to be amazing, to expand the earth, to fill it, to tend the earth, and see all of our dreams arise. I think a lot of us, without even realizing it, we put caps on dreams because of preconceived worldview that develops a box that we view what can be God and what can't based on what's happening in the earth. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. The latest Seth Godin book I started listening to, who I'm aware that he's a Christian, but these books that I'm recommending by him are not like they're for anybody, right? But it's called the Icarus deception. Have you ever do you remember that Greek myth or whatever?
I'm not too familiar with it.
So basically, as the myth goes, this guy and his son, they make these wax wings, and over some sea called like the Icaranian Sea or whatever it is. I got the details all mixed up, but the gist of the story is he tells him, but don't fly too close to the sun, and like don't fly too high in the sky. And then what happens is the son doesn't the kid doesn't listen to his dad, so he flies higher and higher, and the sun starts melting the wax of his wings, and they break, and he falls to his death. And so there's this idea he's positing that like we're afraid of flying too high because of this myth, and but the part of the myth that people leave out, he says, is where his dad also told him don't fly too low to the sea like either, because like the moisture of the water will also damage your wings. So it's like we're too preoccupied on not flying too high when we should also be worried about or avoiding flying too low, staying too close to the surface.
And if you fly too low and you get consumed by the sea or something, then your voice, your legacy is missing from history because you were afraid to let loose and go for it.
Right.
And I don't want the listener or me or you or anyone else to have that happen. No one else in all of creation, time, eternity, past, present, or future can do what I can do in my generation, because God looked at me and said, Dave Edwards needs to be alive at this point in history to do this specific thing that's going to reveal a specific aspect of my heart.
Right. That
fulfills generations that went before me, because they made a way for me to exist and to know the gospel. And that also puts me in that link in time and history, because my voice and my legacy can impact future generations. And the same thing with you, and the same thing with the creations that we come up with. The same thing with like one of my books, Activating a Prophetic Lifestyle. I wanted to see that book activate people in prophetic for years to come. You said you want to fire on your head on the internet for decades, because that can be a voice that activates people for years and years to come. And so we don't, how many histories and how many destinies of people who have gone before us or even around us in our generation are missing. They're missing. Their voice wasn't heard because they were afraid to fly. And I'm not putting the responsibility. Things in life can be tough. It can be hard to have the resources to jump out and do it. But I think that's where faith comes in. I think that's where having these creative material that you and I are just possessed with putting out. Let's write another book. Let's do another podcast. Because we want it to be fuel. We want it to be fire on your head for you to arise in your own destinies and callings, to shape and to terraform this world into the image of Jesus.
Right. And even, like, I don't know if you remember where I was really toying with the idea of ending this podcast after episode 100 and going to, I'd keep podcasting, but just come up with a different show or a different something.
Yeah, totally.
And I don't even remember exactly what tipped the scale and made me decide, no, okay, I'll stick with it. But there's a lot more vision and focus that like I feel like I've gotten since that tipping point, not just interviewing people more than before, and not just having like a bit of a different look and feel and branding to it than we had before, like having somebody else do it for me instead of doing it ourselves.
Yeah.
But anyway, and like I was writing something somewhere on the internet and said like, oh, my podcast is for kicking people out of the upper room. And I was like, wait a minute. Of course it is. Like it always has been. And then somehow I've been tracking a lot lately with people, not the least of which is Steve Crosby, about organic church and disciple making and these things related to the Duns. I don't know if you've listened to those episodes lately. And they've been tracking with people probably more than I've seen this show ever do in the past. And I look at like the almost 9 years since I started this with my laptop in Holland with Dan Slavin, and I'm like, well, of course.
How long have you been in Peru now?
7 years.
Dang. I mean, I know I just threw a number out, but actually can think about when you were actually back in Holland to Canada to being sent. I remember you trying to get support to get sent to Peru, and it's just crazy, like how far we come. I talked to Brian Gearin the other day. He's been a guest on the podcast, but we're like, I've talked to him over the years, but I haven't actually seen him in person since Fire School Administrating. It's like, how long ago was that? It's like 15, 16 years ago. And it's like,
we're getting old.
We're like adults now or something. Something's happened, but
right.
Not to cut off your train of thought, but
no, but
totally.
But I'm more like saying it's gotten like more concise and more laser focused for me as time went on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And then,
absolutely.
And then I don't know if there's a statistic for how this works, but a lot of people who contact me or I see in Facebook or something that they're going to start a podcast and stuff, I see a lot of people start and they run hard out of the gate. Let's not even just talk about podcasting, but like other creative ventures, you know, maybe music or blogging or, you know, some kind of artistic expression. But because my point of reference is podcasting, I see people start and they give it a good like year or whatever, at some people less, and then they just kind of give up on it. And a few people wrote me at different times the last year or two and said, you know, I'm struggling on my podcast with how to keep putting out an episode every week. How do you do it? And I said, I don't. You know, and in some in some circles I follow, they say you need to be consistent. And I've taken breaks. I've you know, like September or whatever it was, I recorded with Dan daily, and then I didn't post anything again until this past January. And nobody cares. Nobody says anything to me. I mean, the numbers drop because people aren't listening to new episodes and stuff. I think in around the time I got married or whatever, it was like 6 months of not podcasting. And so I keep writing back to people who tell me like, or ask me about how they can keep up the weekly or the regular rhythm that they're establishing. And I keep saying like, I don't bother to try to do that. And it seems like people don't mind. I mean, podcasting is, you know, it's however you want to do it. There's not like a hard, fast rule that it has to be this often or that often. So I keep telling people like, take breaks or pace yourself at a slower pace, or, you know, like look at people who take sabbaticals in their professions. Look at, you know, like musicians who, you know, I'm a fan of POD, and it's like 4 years since they released their last album, or 4 years before, you know, the one before that, or U2 or whatever. You know, they take 4 or 5 years to produce albums and stuff, and nobody cares. The quality is good. But can you imagine, like, if we did rush to get things out there on too frequent of a basis, then yeah, the quality can suffer. Maybe the vision of the person can suffer. Well,
I think in your case, that's something that you learned over time, and also you had a treasure chest of content. But I think for the average person, yeah, don't rush it, but just be consistent with when you have the time to do it. Just make sure you do it.
Right.
And if the season shifts, allow the season to shift. I mean, time goes by. I think we can bend time. We can do all kinds of amazing creative things with time. But yeah, totally tracking. Allow the expression to be genuine and real. Add a little bit of discipline to it, but also add rest to it.
Right.
Too much rest, you're not going to be productive. Too much discipline, you're going to come out with boring, bland content.
Right. Well, not even that, but the idea of this podcast being like each episode is the most recent MP3 being added to a collection or an archive, rather than trying to be like, okay, let's talk about what's going on in the world this week. You know, like, oh, this happened. We got to talk about that. And, you know, like, to not follow that rhythm of a show has helped make it much easier to talk about. You know, I mean, we might talk about trends, but we're not talking about like fads and the ones that have been about like flash in the pan in the news this week and not in the news the next week. I think those episodes don't really last as far as like the hits I see them getting in the archives. Those episodes don't really last long. But
yeah, I mean, if I'm scrolling through an internet search and I come across something that was yesterday's news, I'm not inclined to read it unless it's become something that is now part of history.
Right.
You know.
Right.
But timeless content, and you've always had that. You know, what was Fire on Your Head's motto? Was something about revival?
Yeah.
Back in the day. I can't remember
maybe.
exactly worded it, but
I can't really remember how I worded it either. Like stirring people up to revival or something.
yeah, something like that.
But I like the kicking people out of the upper room, because most people will know what I'm talking about if I say upper room, right?
Yeah.
And
the first thing they did when they got filled with fire was that they ran outside. If you're inside of a house and you catch on fire, what do most people do? They leave the house.
Right.
I was just with Todd White. I mean, not personally, but I was part of an event he was at. And he was talking about expressing the gospel and what it looks like when you get filled with the Spirit and when you speak in tongues and when that holy, consumption of the Spirit takes place. He's like, if someone walks up to you, Todd said, and dumps gasoline on your head and then takes out a match and lights you on fire, at that moment in time, you're not going to care at all what anyone in the world thinks about you.
Right.
That is not even going to cross your mind. The only thing that's going to cross your mind is what's happening to your body and to put that fire out. Well, if you get set on fire truly with the Spirit, was his point, you're not going to care what people think about you.
Right.
And you're going to go out and you're going to go for it. And I think that can tie into our dreams. Don't worry about what other people say. Like there's a meme or a video that went around for a while from Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's like, ignore the naysayers. There we go. We just went from Todd White to Arnold.
Right.
But ignore the naysayers. And he was talking about how he fulfilled his dreams. And he was like, work like HE double hockey stick. Don't want to offend the listener. And ignore the naysayers. And don't worry about what people say. That's not saying you throw off mentors or advisors or have people. It says in the Psalms, he who wages war surrounds himself with an abundance of advisors.
Right.
So you'll know your advisor because even in their rebuke, their goal and their heart is going to be to see you fly higher. It kind of goes back into that thing. He's like, fly, but don't let the wings melt. Fly, but don't get sucked up by the ocean. But fly,
Right. It's
It didn't say, well, you might go too high or too low, so don't even try it. Go for it.
Right. What's funny is you made me think of Arnold Schwarzenegger. Because I'm trying to step up my game, I'm always listening to different podcasts, different interviews, different shows. And one of the ones I keep going back to and checking out is Tim Ferriss's podcast. He's the guy that wrote the 4-Hour Workweek. And so the first one I checked out was he interviewed Arnold Schwarzenegger, and they talked about that kind of stuff. How did you go from, being this nobody in Austria to mega movie star and governor of California and all that kind of stuff. And, I'm not recommending this. I'm just sharing it for laughter. Is one thing Arnold Schwarzenegger also did was mess with the heads of his competition. So he would be you're in the gym, and maybe you'll appreciate this stuff more than me since you're a trainer and whatnot. So he'd be in the gym and go up to somebody are you feeling all right? You look like maybe you've been sick lately or something.
Yeah, he was the master of that. If you watch his old movies, I mean, he's trash talker. I mean, like Muhammad Ali, it was
right. And he would sow seeds of doubt into the minds of his competitor. One of the things he said in that interview, and maybe you've seen it on a video or something, he'd be like, your thighs are looking kind of like a woman,
oh crap, dude.
Your thighs are looking very flabby, and then he'd watch people not pull themselves away from the mirror and just keep staring at the mirror while he goes and works out. And so he would do stuff like that. He wouldn't just go for it, but he would also try to knock his competition down a few notches. And so I wrote this little note to remind myself to tell you, it's a joke people have heard of, or maybe they've seen it on Facebook about, and I'm gonna hijack it for our conversation about. Have you ever heard about the 10 monkeys that are put in a controlled test room?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, so I'll tell it for the listener who might not have, but where they have 10 monkeys and they have this ladder in the middle of the room and a bunch of bananas at the top of the ladder. And as soon as, they all climb the ladder and they try to get the bananas, the people who are doing this experiment, they spray them all with a hose or something, right? They do something to make it very unpleasant. And so they all give up and stop trying to go for those bananas. So then they take one of those monkeys out of the room and put a new one in. And the new monkey just looks at everybody and doesn't understand why nobody's attempting the obvious, and there's a bunch of bananas at the top of the ladder. So that monkey tries to climb the ladder, and all the other ones pull him down and beat him up and stop him from climbing the ladder. So he stops, right? And then they take another monkey out and replace him with a new one. And that new one looks around and goes through the same pattern. Like, why is nobody trying to get those bananas? He attempts to climb the ladder. They all pull him down. And so, like, one by one, they take each of these monkeys out of the room and add new ones, so that eventually there's no original monkeys left in the room. And they're all new ones that have been introduced after the first batch were all sprayed with that hose. And the joke goes, like, this monkey, the 10th one, attempts to climb the ladder, and everybody pulls him down, beats him up, and whatever, having no idea why they're doing it. They're just repeating a pattern that was, like, established for them. And the joke goes, this is how a lot of company policies are started, But I was thinking to myself, like, like taking that Icarus mythology and stuff, a lot of the times, like, our vision or our dreams or our things that God's spoken to us to do are attempts at climbing that ladder to get those bananas, and other people around you who maybe don't see the point, or they basically we all have monkeys surrounding us, who will try to pull us off that ladder and talk us out of whatever maybe God's called us to do. You don't want to go to the mission field there. They're killing missionaries. Or, over there, they cut your head off if you proclaim you follow Jesus. You know what? You can't go for that dream of yours because you might fail at it, or, the success rate of, or, like I remember a hockey player friend of mine who's like, I'm not going to name drop, but and but like a lot of people tried to play for this one team locally, and then go on to the next one and stuff, and the number of people who are successful diminishes. And someone else was telling me that he was told the average career span of like an NHL hockey player or something is not very many years or something like that. And said to him, well, best of luck to you. And it was like, there's always going to be somebody that says, you know what, the career span of somebody who gets into that is short. You know what, only so many out of 1,000 manuscripts get accepted by publishers. So good luck with that. Or there's always some monkey that's there to try to pull you off the ladder, And so where am I going with this? I don't know. That we need to ignore those monkeys. I guess. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think it ties into just what I was talking about earlier, even the church advancing. No, we've always done it this way, and there's a speaker I like to listen to named Justin Abraham, and he's like, we've forgotten where we've been. He's talking about encounters and some of the stuff that he's seeing God do, some amazing, crazy stories, stuff you would never dream of, and it's like, this has happened all throughout church history, but we've forgotten where we've been. And if you look at what happens is like the church should go through this cooling phase. It's like this erupting volcano, and then everyone builds their expression around that volcano that has now cooled and become a mountain. And so all the theology, all the universities begin teaching about how God moved then. So when God begins to do something new in our generation, oh, that's not God. That's not how it happened. Because they're looking at that pattern. Right. You can't go up and get your own bananas. This is how it's been done. And all of a sudden they look at the entire context of church history through the lens of their own experience and their own Christian circle, and they read into history and they read into the Bible their experience.
Right.
Rather than the Bible being a constant call to emerge, to go higher, to go for it, to dream, to fly, to become everything you're created to be.
Right.
And so those patterns, or you can even call it tradition, this is how we do it. Traditions are great if it becomes a foundation and a building block for the future, if it becomes something that you can use to build the city of tomorrow. And I think I've used this illustration on here before, but talking about seeing it before you do it, you had the dream of a podcast. We both had dreams of books. Walt Disney had the dream of Disney World. And then he actually passed away before Disney World in Orlando opened. And then the opening day, one of the people standing there looked at his brother and said, only if Walt could have been here to see it. And his brother looked at him and said, he did see it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be seeing it now.
Right.
So he was able to build that dream in the earth, even though he didn't experience it himself. The generations after generation that's come after him has been able to see it. David had a dream to build the temple, and then his son built it, and the generations after got to experience it. Jesus had a dream to build the church, and he left all the building materials for it to be built, just like David left the materials for the temple to be built. Jesus left the materials for the eternal tabernacle to be built in our hearts. Generation after generation now it's being built.
Right.
But the goal is for it to continue to expand. It's like Paul said, I wish I could give you meat, but you're still drinking milk. The goal isn't to be stopped by a pattern. The goal isn't to be stopped by these shells of the nuts we've always eaten on the ground. Rather, we can climb the ladder and we can get the banana, that heavenly banana. That banana, I'm just joking, dude.
Right.
But you know what I'm saying.
Go for the heavenly bananas.
Go for the heavenly bananas. That would be a great title, but I don't know if the viewer or the listenership would be attracted. But that could,
Well, when has that ever stopped us?
When has that ever stopped us?
With our... Yeah, I mean...
heavenly bananas. I'm not serious.
No, I after we came up with this, I'm thinking of somehow incorporating monkeys into the title of the podcast. Not every title of a podcast has to be like SEO friendly. It can be creative.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to do that with this one.
Well, I feel like ours are always out there anyways.
Yeah, I mean, like I was telling you offline, and this isn't like a put down, but like I record conversations with you because I want to record conversations with you. And I'm not thinking of like how to attract people to listen to it because there's already plenty of people who contact me or they contact you or they come up to you at churches or something and say that like, I've always enjoyed those podcasts you do with Dave Edwards. And yeah, I mean, I definitely hope we can do these more often than once a year. I know there's being able to coordinate things on both our ends to make that happen. And it's been tricky lately, but
no, I've really enjoyed it today. I mean, it was a totally different direction than I was expecting. But again, I feel like they always are. But
I had no idea what to expect today because of how it always goes.
But I mean, you think about who this podcast, we're just sitting here sharing our hearts. But I think either for, in a few weeks, whenever this is released, or years down the road, I think it's going to be impactful for the right person at the right moment. And it could even be us re-listening to it in another 5 or 6 years,
Right. I mean, I listen to my own podcasts, and I'll admit the ones that I do with you are the ones that I pick up out of the archive and I re-listen to like a dozen times. And like I said, just like in the last month, I was listening to those ones on repentance again. And I'm like, I was in this conversation. I've listened to this like a dozen times, and I'm still getting like fresh manna out of it. And I stand behind almost any episode of the podcast I record or any interview I do, but like not all of them are like that, where I can go back and listen to them repeatedly.
Speaking of repentance, man, do I got some new stuff on that. We definitely needed to get in some conversations about that and kainos and being a new creation. And I think it's been long enough. We can maybe revisit it a little bit, or even if you're listening, whet your appetite. Go back, find the old one, and then we'll. Within a year, hopefully drop some more.
Yeah, for sure.
That, but
sooner than a year from now. I mean, I suppose people who are new to the podcast and they go and listen to everything in the archive, I'm sure for them it's like not a long wait.
Yeah.
If you could just go.
Well, some people might be like, "Who is this Dave Edwards guy? He's been on the show before, or what?"
Right. A podcast about monkeys? What on earth? I tuned in because I'm done with church or whatever.
The heavenly banana.
No, but and you can say no if the answer is no, but have you listened to those convos, those chats, like especially the Dan Daly one?
I have not listened to Dan Daly. I don't know which of the most recent ones I've listened to.
Sure. Well, no worries. But that's definitely you were talking a minute ago about the viral one with Dima and talking about Googling your tongues. Yeah. Well, like that's taken it to another level, and I've like if people listening, you're listening because you've gotten in touch or you listened to that episode or whatever it is, and you're not familiar with Fire in Your Head. Yeah, I admit this is probably more in tune with the types of episodes we normally do. you know? And, but that one, you know, it's like 1,200 people have listened to it. And, for Fire in Your Head standards, that's like viral. People are surprised when I tell them how few hits this show gets. But I like, what's that?
I was going to say, if you're a listener and you like that episode, by all means, share it.
Yeah, that's definitely what's happened.
Yeah.
But, you know, like that type of number isn't like, I'm not running with the big dogs yet. But, you know, when I think of sitting at this desk or, you know, wherever I've recorded, sitting at your table in Atlanta or whatever, and knowing that like, okay, we're not just having a conversation, but there's like something being created and like hundreds of people, maybe 1,000 eventually, will hear it, benefit from it, take something that they got out of it and impact their lives or change their mind or perspective or whatever about something. And, yeah, that excites me. In fact, let me just throw this in there because I know we're going to have to wind down shortly. There's Cliff Ravenscraft. He's the podcast answer man. He's got this podcast and he's been doing it since like 2005 or whatever. And he's basically like one of the top 3 or 4 go-to guys who have a podcast about making podcasts. And so I don't listen to him every episode, but like I scroll through, and if I see something that's interesting, I check it out. That's how I do it, right? Or if I'm Googling something, I basically go to his website and look for it first. And then there's 2 other guys I also do that with. So I saw that he was a guest speaker at some conference, and I forget what the title was, but it caught my attention. I went and listened to it. And he was basically saying, like, you would be surprised to hear how small my audience is, you know, when you think of how I'm the podcast answer man, that I'm on the conference circuit and stuff like that. But I have influencers who listen to the podcast. You know, and he was talking about how like Michael Hyatt, you know, a lot of listeners might know who that is, that he basically like, you know, did his podcasting A to Z course, learned how to make an excellent podcast. And then he recommends everybody go to Cliff Ravenscraft all the time. But like he said something about like, you know, don't look at your numbers, but look at your influence. You know, look at who you're influencing. Yeah,
that's good, man.
And me and you know at least 1 or 2 high profile people who do listen to us. And, you know, I'm not going to name drop, obviously, but a couple high profile people that listen to us. And I'm like, okay, so like I might not have like, I sit at this desk and I can type this in and there's going to be a lot of numbers, but we've got this kind of like community, you know, we've got this kind of tribe of people who are into it and who are along for the journey. And among those, some of them have such huge influence. Like, you know, imagine like David, someone listening to this and they take something you've said, some insight, some revelation, and it changes their paradigm. And then they get up and they speak to their, you know, pretty large church, and they're influencing and they're impacting like, you know, untold numbers of people. I mean, that's pretty exciting to me. So like I've stopped worrying about numbers years ago. And then when I listened to that podcast recently, it kind of reinforced for me like, yeah, I mean, all it takes is influencing people who they themselves have a large influence, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And if your goal, I mean, expanding platform is awesome.
It would be, wouldn't it?
I think if your goal is to release the stuff that Jesus has spoken to you in the secret place, and just all this platform is just a way to express and to build the kingdom in the earth. And that is most important. And then as you steward that, the influence will come. And then after the influence, I think the reach is going to come too.
Right. Well, bro, looking at the time, which means nothing to people listening to this on a podcast feed, but I got to make lunch for my wife and daughter who are kindly doing something else so that I could have some quiet here to record with you. But any last thought or anything? We got like 5, maybe 10 minutes max before we end this. Any last minute thing you want to throw out there before who knows the next time we talk is?
I don't know. It seems like this became an impromptu conversation about going for your dreams, learning to fly, not letting anyone hold you back. but doing it from that heart of just keeping Jesus first. I mean, that's where I've really been personally lately. Is I actually recently found myself like I knew I had ministry coming up in January, like several weeks in a row, a couple of big events, and then some personal ministry and dates lined up, and I was like, I've got to seek Jesus because I have these ministry events coming. But then, like, I should have already been seeking Jesus because I'm in love with Jesus for who Jesus is, where he is, as he is. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, just keeping the main thing. I don't think it's wrong to be prepared, even to prepare yourself for what's coming in the secret place.
Right.
I was trying to prepare myself, albeit briefly, earlier this morning. Like, I'm on the podcast today. Jesus, be with us on the podcast. And if I'm going to speak, I'm like, Jesus, be with me there. But I don't want that to be my driving emphasis. I want my driving emphasis to be because I love Jesus. I love being in his presence. I love spending that time with him. And then everything else begins to flow out of that. The desire to impact people when they hear me speak begins to flow out of that. The desire to impact people through a podcast or something I've written flows from that, not vice versa. You know what I'm saying? And then when you are successful, when the podcast does blow up, here you go, Jesus. Like Bill Johnson says, I just go back in my quiet place. And if someone says, you were amazing, I say thank you. But then when no one else is looking, I pour all of that glory, all of that honor back on the feet of Jesus. And I feel like you've stewarded this well. Every time we do the podcast, you're like, bro, let's pray. Let's go for it. Let's have heaven involved in what we talk about today, whether it's impromptu, whether it's all over the place. And I think this becomes the secret genius of how it can be a lasting impact of it. Somebody is going to listen to this at the right time to add something to their life that keeps them going so that their history isn't eradicated from the timeline, but it actually adds to it everything it was intended and designed to do.
Right. And I mean, we're not even done finding out how your writings, how this podcast, how things we've done can keep impacting people. Like, that's why I've always had a desire to do stuff that can last. Like, I don't, if the listener wants to go and listen to an episode on this feed that I preached at my church while I was in Canada, where we talked about time and like, what are you doing with your time on this earth and stuff. I share a lot more of my thoughts there, but the idea of, a book can go places you can't. Either the podcast can exist, if something were to happen to me tomorrow, there's this archive of stuff future people can be listening to and get an impact from. So I've always wanted to do that, create something. When the parable of the steward, he gives something to each. Oh, guess what? They're home. So I'm gonna have to cut this off. I'll tidy up the ending. Can you hear that?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. So I did tell her 12 and she took her time and she's home now. So that's okay. I'll edit it in somewhere where you said something and what I really love is if I had some kind of phrase or ending to invite the guest to say. And if you think of something like that, let me know. But the obvious is something like fire in your head, but I don't want to say that. So like there's this podcast I listen to, and the guy always has his guests say, can you say keep it crispy? And I'm like, what? But that's just what they do. I'd love it if we had some kind of tradition I could get the guests to say. But anyway, it's definitely time to end this. I'm not going to have quiet anymore. But
yeah, dude, it's been great to be back on today. It's been awesome. And,
I enjoyed it. I'm glad we did this.
Yeah, and I've got more content brewing inside of me of stuff I thought we would get to, but that felt right. I feel like that conversation is going to be key if our goal is to really impact the listener. And so I think people are going to take a lot out of it. But
okay, well, say something. Say God bless. I'm going to
hasta la bye-bye? No, I don't want to keep saying that.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.
We hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, you can find us in iTunes or on Stitcher Radio, or directly at fireonyourhead.com for more options. If you want to support Steve and Lily Bremner as missionaries in Peru, or find out more about what they do, be sure to head over to their blog at stevebremner.com, or check out Steve's Kindle books on Amazon and leave reviews of the ones you liked. See you next time.